great. So I was thinking about this. I was just talking to them. We have been doing Pints and Politics now for a year. So we had this idea that people might want to get together and drink beer and talk about politics. And it's been great. We've seen a lot of candidates. In fact, we have 14 people on the ballot in South Carolina for the Democratic primary. And of the people that are on the ballot, all but 4 have done Pints and Politics. So, which is pretty amazing. We are working on getting those final 4. People have asked me, if you're new to this, people have asked me how do I know when the next candidate is going to be up? We don't have a schedule. This is a very pop-up event. Palmetto Brewery is always ready to help us. A campaign calls us, says, I'm ready in 2 days. And we send out an email blast. It's at the top of the Palmetto Politics newsletter that Caitlin Bird writes. If you are not signed up for the Palmetto Politics newsletter, it comes to your inbox 5 days a week at 8:30, postandcourier.com/newsletters. Sign up. What else do people need to know?
The primary is on February 29th. So if you're just tuning into the 2020 cycle, this is a really great introduction to it. We also hold it at breweries because we want it to be informal, because politics for so long has seemed out of reach for so many of us. And honestly, reporters shouldn't be the only ones getting access to the candidates. So we appreciate all of you coming out today because this event is so much more about you guys than it is about any of us up here. No offense, Governor.
Describes my politics too.
So I want to introduce everyone on stage and then I'll sit down. This is Caitlin Bird, who I already introduced to you, our Palmetto Politics newsletter editor and political reporter. On the far end, asking questions, is Skylar Croft. He's our political editor. And then the governor. Welcome.
Awesome.
You have a very long biography, so I am going to self-edit your own biography for you.
That's my editor for you.
Deval Patrick is the former governor of Massachusetts. He was elected to the post in 2006, succeeding Mitt Romney.
Massachusetts in the house, all right. All right, excellent.
See, the Yankees are coming, we're all screwed. It's just a matter of time before Charleston changes.
We are very careful not to say the word Yankees in Massachusetts. For other reasons entirely.
How long have you been working on that one? That's pretty good. He was born on the south side of Chicago. He lived with his grandparents, mother and sister, where he frequently slept on the floor because there were not enough beds in there. But he was smart enough and people took an interest in him. He went to Harvard University where he graduated with honors in 1978. He then lived and worked in Africa for a year. He spent most of that time on a United Nations youth training project in the Darfur region of Sudan. While abroad, he was admitted to Harvard Law School. Had a long legal career. After serving as a law clerk for a year to a federal appellate judge, he joined the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He devoted most of his time to death penalty and voter rights cases. And interesting turn, it was through his work for the Legal Defense Fund where he first met some governor from Arkansas. Is that correct? In 1986, Patrick joined the Boston law firm of Hill and Barlow, where he became a partner in 1990. Did some pro bono work there. In 1994, President Bill Clinton appointed him as the nation's Attorney General for civil rights. He worked in the private sector for a while before deciding to enter into politics. He oversaw the implementation as governor of the state's health care reform plan, raised the state's minimum wage from $8 an hour to $11 an hour, and also joined the Massachusetts Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. After leaving the governor's office, he worked as a managing director at Bain Capital. He has been married to his wife, Diane, for 36 years, and they have 2 adult daughters, Sarah and Catherine. All right, we're going to go ahead with the first question.
All right.
Yes, that was quite the intro. So let's start from the top. In November, with less than 3 months until the Iowa caucuses, you announced your candidacy in a YouTube video.
Yep.
And then before that, you had been actually a contributor on CBS News where you were analyzing many who are in the current field now with you.
Yes.
So what was the tipping point for you? Because everyone's talking about how you got in late, and you say later.
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 Not late. Yes.
So tell me what the tipping point was.
Yeah. So, first of all, good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming out, and thanks very much for having me. Katie, quite honestly, there wasn't a one tipping point. It was
Is there a center mic? Let's try this one.
there wasn't.
That's not connected? All right.
Try this. All right. All right. I have to answer Caitlin's question facing this way, because if I turn this way, the thing will go out again.
Oh.
So it wasn't a one thing or one event. It's not like I wanted to be president, frankly. I've had one elective office, and that was governor of Massachusetts, I think we got a lot of good done. We don't have term limits in Massachusetts. I have a term limit named Diane, who said 2 terms and that's it. You got to come home. But you know, there are lots of ways to serve. So I was looking at how to help other candidates, how to help in other civic ways. President Trump was elected. That was not the tipping point. Charlottesville happened, and that made me think, but then lots of my friends started to get into the race, lots of talent on the Democratic side. You know, I'm a Democrat. I don't think you have to hate Republicans to be a good Democrat, but I was focused on the Democratic side. And then the midterms came, and I got involved in a bunch of races, including Joe's. We were talking about Joe Cunningham down here. 14 races. All of the ones that I worked on were so-called red to blue districts or states, and excuse me, I hate that term, but that's what they were called. We won 10. We lost 3 by a hair, and 1 was a do-over because they cheated so bad in North Carolina. And I was affirmed in something I had suspected, which is that if we come to people and ask that they be a part of rebuilding a national community where we see a stake in our neighbors' dreams and struggles as well as our own, then we can win and deserve to win, that we can then govern. So I got serious in 2018 about joining the race, and we set a date. We had a date around Thanksgiving, and about 2.5 weeks before, my wife Diane was diagnosed with uterine cancer. And that sort of thing just brings your feet back to earth. We celebrated 35 years. Thank you for giving me credit for 36. 35 years last May, and praise God, she is cancer-free. Yes. And she's the real political junkie in our family. She reads everything, she studies everything, and she kept saying, "You have got to get in. There's something missing." So we did a lot of praying, a lot of thinking, a lot of talking to other people. Got a ton of encouragement. You know, the stuff that comes from your friends is lovely. The stuff that comes from total strangers is moving. People you've never met, just over the transom. And decided to step on out because I don't think it's too late. In fact, you know, that's a kind of a narrative. But the one who's winning in the horse race right now is somebody called undecided. 60-70% of the vote in all of the early states. So to me, it feels like, you know, it's like a party. You know, you're not late if the music hasn't even started before you get there. And I think people are, you know, I realize I have to earn it. I have to go, I have to reintroduce myself to people, in many cases, introduce myself to people, but make sure and make plain that for me, the difference between me and the other very capable candidates is that they have ideas, I actually have results. There are things I have delivered on, and proof points about what it takes, not just to reform big systems, but to grow the economy out so that it reaches the middle and the marginalized and not just up to the well-connected.
Fantastic. We'll get into that. Okay. I'll let Skylar take the next one.
All right, well, I'm going to do a little bit of math here. So far, 14 candidates have come and 14 remain. You said voters are still looking for the alternative to these front riders. What makes you that alternative? You're a Northeast liberal from a tax-heavy state. A state that saw rate increases under your tenure. I mean, that sounds kind of familiar.
I don't need that.
No, it's funny. You know, I'll say this about Massachusetts. First-time candidate, 1% name recognition, 2% on the days we were bragging. In a state where the dynamic is less Republican, Democrat than it is insider, outsider, if you know what I mean. It's very, very tight, inward-looking political establishment, very hard to break in. We built at the grassroots, we governed at the grassroots. As soon as I was elected, the bottom fell out of the global economy. 8 years later, Massachusetts was #1 in student achievement, in healthcare coverage, in veteran services, in entrepreneurial activity, in energy efficiency, with a 25-year employment high, responsible budgets, and the highest bond rating in the history of the Commonwealth. That did not happen by accident, and that didn't happen by me alone. It was about setting a very, very ambitious agenda, engaging people who brought their best, including people who didn't agree with us, and working together, not just in time for or in the interest of the next election cycle, but the next generation. That is different than some of what is on offer today. 99% of the people in Massachusetts have health care today. Other people talk about it, we did that. We have a national model addressing climate change. We've worked through criminal justice reform and what the puts and takes of that are. And yes, we did raise taxes, especially at the point we raised the sales tax from 5% to 6.25%, I think it was.
Still lower than Charleston.
All right, don't get all up in my grill then. If it's still lower. But my point is that we do this thing around taxes, in that conversation around taxes. Nobody runs for office to raise taxes. The question, it seems to me, is what is it we want government to do and not do? And what does that actually cost? And then what's the sensible and equitable way to pay for that? And I think that's why you see the results in the schools, the expansion of healthcare, the investment in infrastructure, the cultivation of an innovation economy that enabled us to get to a 25-year employment high, particularly out of the trough of a recession. And I think there are some of those kinds of things that apply nationally. Does that make sense? Okay.
Can you talk through, you've said repeatedly on the trail, even when you've been up in New Hampshire, that you plan to make South Carolina and New Hampshire a priority. Realistically, what is your South Carolina plan? Like, what's your ground game here? How much time do you realistically want to spend?
All my secrets.
Well, some.
Okay.
Some, please.
So we
Make
are,
us feel good here in South Carolina.
So we are present in all of the early states. So Iowa, is it okay? I'm sorry, everybody. It's probably me. We are present in all of the early states. So in Iowa, in New Hampshire, in Nevada, and in South Carolina. But we are placing emphasis on South Carolina and New Hampshire because primaries are just different than caucuses, and we have to respect the schedule. So I want to be clear, we're not ignoring other states, but basically I am dividing my time and Diane her time between New Hampshire and South Carolina, mainly, between now and the primaries. And it gives me another opportunity to make a point. As president, expect to see me in between elections. And I want to make this point emphatically because I learn by being with people and listening to people. And it's not just, I don't want to just have the job, I want to do it. And I'm not that interested in abstract policy. I'm interested in policy where it touches people. And so I have a policy agenda where we've framed it. We'll be rolling out elements of it over the next couple of weeks. But it is very much to provoke a conversation about whether this is what it really takes to help rebuild the American dream.
Explain the genesis of your relationship with Barack Obama, and can you share what advice he did give you before you jumped into this? It's not something done lightly, and he's got some wisdom that goes with running for office a couple times. And what did he tell you? And including about being in South Carolina.
You ready? No. I was working in the Clinton administration. A president you mentioned who I met when he was governor of Arkansas, and I sued him in a voting rights case. And we worked out the settlement together and built a relationship. And the White House counsel at the time was a former congressman and former judge from Chicago, federal judge, but from Chicago, who knew this guy called Barack Obama from the University of Chicago. And he said to me, you know, you remind me of him and he reminds me of you. Do you know this guy? And I said, I heard his name, but I've never met. He said, the next time you go to Chicago, you should look him up. And I did. And I met this tall, skinny guy with a funny name who was practicing voting rights law. This probably was 96 or 7. And he hadn't run for anything. And, you know, we stayed in touch. I was immediately impressed. We stayed in touch. I remember he ran for state senate, Schuyler, and he called me, and I was an executive at Coca-Cola at the time, and commuting back and forth to Atlanta. And he called and he said, Deval, I'm running. He said, I'd love to have your help. And I said, Barack, it's about time. I'm so excited. I want to help. And he said, you can make a contribution. I said, I will give it the max. And he said, Deval, he said, Illinois has no max. And I said, brother, I'm sorry, there has to be a max. But I'm so proud of him and how he built. And then when he won his Senate race, the U.S. Senate race, I remember going to visit him. He was unpacking his boxes in his basement office in the Senate office building, and I said, Senator, I'm very proud of you. I said, and I'd given him some advice that had come in handy, I think, in the course of his race. And I said, you know what? I think I'm going to run for governor. And he said, huh? He said, you got any money? I said, nope. He said, you got any staff? I said, nope. He said, what's your name recognition? I said, 1%, 2% on the days we're bragging. He said, I'm in. And we've kind of been doing this yin and yang ever since. He's been very encouraging, was very encouraging to your question about my running, especially a year ago. But he talked to all the candidates, as is his way. And I don't think was picking favorites. He's very clear about the experience, just the wear and tear and the sometimes cruelty of it, but also the magic of it, especially when people, I mean, it still dazzles me that people set aside what they're doing and they take up your cause and they make it their own, as I think they did particularly in 2008 when we were stumping around Iowa together, and then here with Governor Hodges and Governor Mabus, who came over the weekend before the primary. When I called him to say, and we haven't spoken since I stepped out, when I called him to say I was going to step out anyway, it was another one of those, huh? And he was absolutely clear about how hard it is. You know, he had the advantage of having been a celebrity when he started to run. You know, to the point about, I think this is really the late issue. It's being famous, right? It's a name recognition. And I don't have that. I don't have that advantage. But yeah, I think that's about all I'm willing to say.
On the flip side, how about Governor Romney, who went through the process and failed?
Yeah.
Did he give you any advice from governor to governor, or even before you launched into this? Because he kind of went through the same thing, but not successfully.
Yeah. So I don't know Governor Romney well. He's always been a gentleman to me. We had the briefest, most cursory transition. You know, it's like they They left a notebook about this thick, and they took all their computer hard drives with them. He was already running. And he hasn't been at Bain Capital for, I don't know, 20, 25 years. So I have not had a conversation with him about this. And of course, he's got his hands full now with another assignment.
And I was going to say one more thing. The real problem, I think, is with the format. You've probably watched all the debates.
I have.
How many of you have watched all the debates? All of them. Good for you.
That's
How many of
impressive.
you have watched early ones and then stopped? I mean, viewership has been sliding, I think, because the format doesn't really serve the purpose of informing people about policy positions. I mean, some of them have been cage fights. And that I don't think it's very good for the party. I don't think it's very good for democracy. So I hope to qualify because everybody's watching to see, do you qualify? But I don't actually want to go because, you know, I'm just being honest. I'd rather have forums where you can, you know, groups of people where you can say, this is what I think. What do you think? You know, you can engage.
This is from one of our questions submitted by someone from the audience. I believe he's a teacher, and this came from one of his 8th graders, and he said, Juan, what would be your plan for criminal justice reform in ways of keeping people out of prisons, educated, and working?
Is it out of bounds to say who asked the question? Because okay, I just like to look at the person who asked the question. Just say your first name so I can. Ryan. So Ryan, first of all, thank you for your service as a teacher. Teachers transform my life. I have a lot of time for teachers. I came here. I was telling you about this just now. I came right here from something called the Turning Leaf Project. You ever heard of it? Yes, sir. It is off the chain. It's some of you should know. If you don't know about it, find out about it. And basically, it's a 4-month, 9-to-5 job and skills training project for people who fit a screen of being most likely to reoffend. I think that's a fair summary. And the focus is on what in some circles, they don't, but what in some circles would be called soft skills, as well as specific job training, and how to learn self-composure, how to learn conflict resolution, how to accept criticism, how to grow with that criticism, how to be a leader. Very important exercises for how people can place themselves in positions to be most successful. Because the truth of the matter is, and I'm going to come to the warehousing issue soon, but the truth of the matter is that, 95% of the people in come out one day. And we've been draining the preparation for coming out, so that sometimes people come out more dangerous than they were when they went back in. So I love this program, and I love what it represents, and I think it's scalable. So a plug to the Turning Leaf project. I think beyond that, some of the things we did in Massachusetts, we eliminated minimum mandatory sentencing for nonviolent drug offenses, because drug addiction belongs in a medical response, not a criminal response. It just doesn't work. Drug courts as a strategy as well. 3 strikes and you're out this is an example of what happens when we govern by slogan, and we got to get past that. Restoring the ability of courts, judges who are prepared and trained to exercise judgment in sentencing, and making it possible so that intentionally, so that people go in, do their time, and are prepared to re-enter productive life, I think is in all of our long-term interests. Thank you for the question.
I think we should start to dive into some policy. And one of the...
That was policy. What are you talking about?
I know, that was a great primer, but we've got kind of a signature question, if you will, that we ask everyone, and we call it the 90-second question. Mm-hmm. And in 90 seconds, we ask every candidate to give us their plan for your first 100 days.
You have got to be kidding.
No, this
Are
is
you
what you
asking to
signed
raise
up
my
for.
hand? Do I support this?
No, this is just you, and you are timed. So, again, just the prompt, 90 seconds. Give us your plan for your first 100 days, and I'm going to queue up my.
I'm not counting, finding the way to the bathroom, using the card
Right.
key, that kind of thing.
We're talking big picture.
Okay. Right.
Proud of
Got it.
policy.
Got it.
All right, are you ready, sir?
I am ready.
All right, the clock starts now.
The democracy agenda, which is a series of policy proposals to address how we've been treating our democracy for a long time, as if it would tolerate limitless abuse without breaking. So money in politics, much of it dark, gerrymandering, vote suppression, that kind of thing. National service, because I think one of the reasons we are so easily divided is that we don't know each other. That is a part of our democracy agenda. We have an opportunity agenda, which is about how we grow the economy out, not just up, based on investing in education, innovation, and infrastructure. And I can get into that in more detail after the 90 seconds. And then the leadership agenda, which is about restoring our stature and our leadership in the world.
You did it with 40 seconds to spare, so for
You wanna
someone
keep
who
going?
seemed a little, you've got 40 seconds if you want to keep going.
Okay.
Go for it.
Well, there's, of course, a whole reform agenda, which is around healthcare and which we should get into, immigration, criminal justice, which we talked about a little bit earlier. These big systems that, frankly, just don't function for modern times. The tax code, both corporate and individual, to support some of these ideas. That's on our list as well. But I think it's important for folks to understand, I don't think most people live their lives in policy silos. It's the interconnection of a policy, which is why we're rolling these out as agenda instead of just individual points.
5 seconds to spare of that, so you did it. Perfect.
I'm never quick, so thank you.
More policy, and it shows, South Carolina is a state of haves and have-nots. What would be your plan to narrow, close the black-white employment, take-home pay, everything within the financial world? How would you address that?
And the other related part of that, at least in my mind and heart, is the wealth gap as well. So I think there are a few things here that we have tried, and we didn't get everything right, but some ideas we have. First of all, we are increasingly, the global economy is increasingly a knowledge-based economy. We shouldn't be afraid of that as Americans. We should own that. We can dominate that. This is still the most creative place on the planet. And so the strategy I talked about in terms of the opportunity agenda, investing in education, pre-K right through public higher ed, in innovation, those industries that depend on brain power, and spreading that out beyond the places like Boston and San Francisco, and infrastructure, because it's the unglamorous work of government, but it supports everything else and creates jobs right now. So why is that a predicate to your question? Because you could be an entrepreneur, start a business, participate in the global economy, living in Round Oak, where I was yesterday, but not if you don't have high-speed internet or reliable cell service or transportation you can count on when you do need to come into Charleston or go up to Columbia for whatever permitting you need. These things are interconnected. You gotta have great schools within reach of every kid. And by the way, where did our teacher friend go? He left? He got his answer and left. What's that? He should, then if he liked my answer, he should bring me one too. The solution to high achieving education is not the same in every place. And so providing a suite of tools and resources and accountability along that is a strategy that goes with that is a strategy I have found that enables well-prepared and supported teachers to reach the kids they are responsible for. And I think we can do much more in that respect. I think home ownership and capital to start companies, not just loans. This is different. This is capital and the coaching and mentorship. Entrepreneurship is something a whole lot of people would like to do, but many of us think it's having a PhD in a garage and creating the next Silicon Valley giant. It's not. I would say in the recession in Massachusetts, we had a whole lot of people who were entrepreneurs of necessity, right? They were just completely dislocated by the economy, and they just had to figure it out on their own or with a family member, and they began to figure out how to create something to provide for themselves and their families. And I think there are lots of opportunities for that, but not without places where you can incubate those ideas with folks who can mentor and coach you in the problem solving that goes with setting up a company and the capital to help to do it. So those are some of the ideas that I have. We didn't get into HBCUs, which I think I'd love to see endowments for, so we can even out the congressional, annual appropriations. I mean, I can go on and on, but those are some of the ideas I have.
We got a number of questions from the audience about healthcare, naturally. Where do you land on the Medicare for All debate that's going on right now?
So can I first say that Medicare for All is another one of those slogans that has turned into, it means a bunch of different things for different people. I wish Ted Kennedy were alive, because this was his idea. What's that? This was his idea. I think the next step so the ACA is based on what we did in Massachusetts. The next step, in my view, is a public option. That option could well be Medicare. But my reason for that is that I think there is something to be gained from the competitive tension of having private insurance, which you better believe will figure out some way to offer a low-cost alternative to capture or to compete for the rush of people who would go to a no-cost or low-cost public option. And that's good, because we need incentives to bring system costs down, and insurance is part of it. And I think there's a value in having innovative pressure on Medicare, if that's the public option, for example, because they have to step up their game. If you're eligible for Medicare today, and you can, most people will buy a supplemental policy on top of that, because Medicare doesn't get it done. And so having that sort of innovative tension because of competition, I think can be a very good thing.
And a follow-up question in the healthcare arena, which also came from the audience. What's your plan for lowering prescription drug costs?
Yeah, I should have asked who asked the other question. Who's the?
There were a slew of healthcare questions.
So you're kind of bunching them together.
I bundled them.
Yeah.
I did.
Isn't it interesting about prescription drug costs? Prescription drugs or medications generally represent about 15% of healthcare of system costs, but it's the thing that touches people, and that's why it's on. I think it is one of the things that most touches people. I should put it that way. And that's why it's on so many people's minds. I think that our answers probably lie in permitting the federal government to compete or to bid for competitive pricing. That is forbidden, or has been forbidden until recently, stupidly, but it was. And frankly, to compete and seek pricing from markets around the world. One of the reasons we have what we have is that the investment largely in prescription drug development comes from the private markets in the United States. And the FDA permits those companies to recoup their investment, and in some cases, and then some, here in the United States. But drug price controls in Europe and in Canada do not permit that. spreading that base over a larger geographic footprint will help. But the other thing that's happened over the years, and Skylar, check me if I'm wrong about this, I think I'm right. We used to do a lot more basic research funded by the federal government, and it was at later stages, not quite at the point of commercialization, but at later stages, when it got tossed over the fence to the private market. And so developing those drugs was cheaper in private markets and therefore cheaper to the consumer. We started pulling research dollars out of NIH, NIS, and the other research functions. More and more private money came in. That private money wants a return. We rebalanced that, and we're a lot of the way there. And that's no small thing. But it's to me, it's short money for big game.
You don't personally support the death penalty, but you've been involved in litigating death penalty cases when you worked for the Legal Defense Fund. You didn't support the death penalty against the Boston Marathon bomber. Tell us, do you think the death penalty was justified in the case of Charleston church shooter Dylan Roof?
You know, I remember one of the first death penalty cases that's a really hard question. One of the first death penalty cases I ever litigated was in Alabama, and I got the case, I want to say maybe a day or two before the execution date. And I was in New York, and we had to find, so it had gone through its the case had gone through its direct appeals. We had to find a local counsel in Montgomery who started the so-called collateral appeal in the state court and went from the trial court to the Supreme Court in about a day and a half. And we were right up against it. The defendant had been taken to the holding cell and had his hair shaved because hair catches on fire when you're electrocuted. And I couldn't get to the judge agreed to give a hearing, but I couldn't get there in time, so we did it over the phone. And I remember this judge, famous old, I won't say his name, but old federal judge. He comes on the phone, he says, all right, he says, who's representing the petitioner? And I said, Deval Patrick, the legal defense fund. All right, Mr. Patrick, hold on. And who's representing the state? And the state attorney came on and introduced himself. I think it was Ed Carnes, who's now a judge. And the judge's response was, hey, Ed, how's your family? How you doing? I thought, okay. And his first question to me was, Mr. Patrick, he said, don't you just think there's some people who ought to die? And I said to him, yes, Your Honor, we're all going to die. The question is whether the state should be in that business. And that's how I feel. You know, I remember being asked when I first ran for governor, you know, what would you do if Diane was brutally murdered and killed? And you know, I'd want to rip that person limb from limb. But I think there's certain kinds of decisions that the government just does not do well. Intimate, hard decisions. The government rarely does well. Choice is like that too, in my mind. And I just rather have a person sentenced to die in prison rather than die by execution.
At a time when more liberal Democrats in the field have been swearing off PAC money, you've said you'd take it to level the field for yourself in the playing field. So my question is, what is your plan for campaign finance reform in more detail?
No PACs. No, I'm not kidding. It's a you know, what I have said is that for any PAC participating in this round on behalf of me or any other Democrat, at a minimum, we ought to be transparent about the donors, at a minimum. And if there is such a PAC out there interested in supporting me, please just keep it positive. We don't need to do, we don't need to tear each other apart. We have competing ideas as Democrats, and frankly, between Democrats and Republicans. I'd rather win it on the strength of my ideas rather than the weakness or the scariness of the others. Because I happen to think if the character of the candidates is an issue in every cycle, this time it's the character of the country. And we have got to call that question. So that's why, that's my view of PACs today. I think we have way too much money in politics generally and too much of it dark. Citizens United has made this worse. I do think we have to start that slow march toward amending the Constitution. But in the meanwhile, and I'm trying to get some advice from real lawyers instead of recovering lawyers about this, what if we just had, what if we started with legislation that simply redefined that a company is not a person? Because it was that predicate decision by the Supreme Court that positioned Citizens United for the outcome it was. This whole idea that the founders thought a company was a person is absurd. All right, so how about we just clarify that? So anyway.
Well, one of the variations of the water. Yeah. Well, one of the
beer, but that's not coming.
One of the variations to it is it seems that our questions were heavily weighted towards healthcare, and then also heavily weighted towards how are you going to take care of seniors. It's a loaded question. What especially do you see happening, not necessarily to be making it to the White House, what's going to happen with healthcare for seniors in the federal government over the course of the next 4 to 6 years?
Skylar, honestly, I think the answer to that question depends on who gets to the White House. If I get to the White House, we have an opportunity, and the opportunity I want us to seize is system reform. Medicare is an incredibly important part of the guarantee we make to seniors, and I think it should be preserved. But I think it has to be improved and modernized. We have a lot of great ideas that just need to be modernized. Great programs and so on that just need to be adapted to today's times. We have generally speaking, a healthcare system which really ought to be a wellness system and not a sick care system the way it is right now. And how we reward that and incentivize that, I think, should be a part of how we think about healthcare reform for seniors as well. And the other thing I would say is that most of the seniors I know or have met, if there's any way possible, want to age in place. They'd like to be home if they can. There's a lot of data that say that outcomes are better for seniors if they are at home and properly supported. And the cost of qualified home care is a fraction of the cost of long-term care in many facilities. So I'm interested in how we scale that. We invested actually in my fund in a company that was trying to build that model. Look at you. Wow, I have completely lost my train of thought. Thank you.
Home care.
No, I was kidding. I remember where I was. I was just thirsty. But no, I think, if I had my druthers, my mother lived with us for 20 years, proving that my wife is a saint. My grandmother, believe me, you don't know my mother. My grandmother was with us in the last couple years of her life. My wife grew up in a multi-generational family. I'm not saying that is the solution, but I know that in my case, my kids, by the way, would not let me live with them, I'm sure. But I would like to be home if I can. And there are, with the right caregiver who gives the rest of the family confidence because the care is compassionate and professional, and with the technologies we have right now for telehealth, and you know, there's even I've seen one where you can talk to your TV and it checks on your vitals every day. I think this is more and more doable and actually quite both dignified and better in terms of outcomes.
So because of your later entrance to the race and because of the increasing qualifications to get on that debate stage, we would like to give you the opportunity to answer 2 questions from last month's debate. The rules are the same, you know, keep it short, 60 seconds. But one question that came up was, do you think Senator Warren's plan offers free college to too many families?
Well, I see our time is up. Look, it's not about too many families. I guess I'm not focused on free college for everybody. I'm focused on free or substantially reduced public colleges and universities, because the reason we are where we are is because we've been slowly draining public out of public education. And you know, in Massachusetts, when I came to office, I think the public to non-public ratio was something like 30% to 70. We got it back up to 50 in exchange for freezing tuition and fees. But if we really want it to be affordable, truly affordable, or free to students and of quality, then we're going to have to put the public all the way in at 100%. And by the way, the dollar we spend on public education is the single best dollar the public spends on our collective best interests, our collective future, at every stage. At every stage. As long as, in my view, we're spending not just more money, but more time and more ideas, investing more time and more ideas, and there's so much creativity. I think the question about debt is separate. So that if you think of that as a go-forward solution, I think that the idea of refinancing existing debt to current interest rates or zero, and crediting that back against principal in the cases of payments that exceed, you know, doing it retroactively would. I haven't finished the analysis, but I think that's going to wipe out a whole lot of it and enable people to go forward. And that system needs to be fixed. But the opportunity changes if at the same time we are looking forward in terms of how we make public colleges and universities genuinely affordable. And the last thing I would say about that is that the way I would pay for that is not the wealth tax.
How would you pay for it?
Well, let me just say, I think the problem is not wealth, it's greed. We want aspiration. You know, I grew up on welfare. I had my chance. I've made some money for my family. That's what we want. What we don't want is the hoarding of all of the goodies in a few, in the hope that it'll trickle down to everybody else. Remember that? We were told that was going to happen starting in 1980, and this is what this looks like, right? This is what this looks like. But we should raise the estate tax. The estate tax was 55%, I think, before the last 2 iterations. And that makes a lot of sense. You know, there is a point where it's too high. And there's a threshold that has to be considered. And that threshold could be higher than it used to be. But that kind of one-time, that to me is the sort of thing you use for one-time things like eliminating existing student debt.
Fortunately, we're up against the clock, but I really want to thank the governor for taking part. I want to thank the folks at Palmetto and y'all for coming out, and just keep attuned to the Post and Courier, and we'll announce the next one as soon as we can. But we're going to finish now with 2 things. We're going to do our lightning speed round, and that might make you still think you're in Massachusetts. And then we're going to give the governor the final 2 words as a closing. So let's go from there. Pass him your microphone.
Okay.
There's a cord around me, so.
Yeah.
Can we try this again?
All right, we'll see what happens.
And we have, I don't like question like a technical.
And I think to explain this, I will ask the first two questions. Caitlin will take the next two. I'll do the next one, and Caitlin will get the final one. All right.
Like one word answers?
No, well, we'll see. We'll see what's in your heart when you answer these.
Okay.
First question is Teddy Kennedy or Tip O'Neill?
Wow, Teddy Kennedy.
Because why? Because why?
Oh, because I knew him best. He was a good friend, wonderful sense of humor, deep, deep, deep compassion.
Big Papi or Tom Brady?
Oh, don't do that. Don't do that. I have to go home safely. Wow. Big Papi. Can I tell you why?
Yeah, please.
Because there was a game the Saturday after the week of the marathon bombing, which was probably one of the most challenging times in our history and certainly in my time as governor. And we were invited to come and walk on the field and just thank the people of Boston. And Big Papi kind of got a little carried away and said something quite colorful, and we all loved him for it and still do.
Love Story, The Paper Chase, Good Will Hunting, another movie. What do you think is the best movie filmed with a Boston backdrop?
What'd you say? Man, I did love Good Will Hunting. Right, who said Breaking Bad?
The theater.
All right.
What is the best?
Wasn't there a movie about the marathon bombing? There was some.
Yeah.
There was, yes.
It wasn't very good though, was it? Yeah. Yeah, I couldn't watch it.
What is the best food that you've had in South Carolina? Please be specific.
So I want you to know I was here on New Year's Eve because of the Emancipation Proclamation event at Mother Emanuel the next morning where I spoke. And so I was away from my family, and it was just me and a staff person in a house of a friend, and I made shrimp and grits, thank you very much. And they were pretty good.
You made it.
Yeah, I made it. Yeah, I like to cook.
All right. What two books, one fiction and one nonfiction, most shaped you? And you cannot pick a religious text.
Really?
Not the Bible, nothing along those lines. Fiction, nonfiction.
Huh. Well, I was an English major in college, so I have a lot to choose from. But I focused on Mark Twain, and there is, Huck Finn was a masterpiece, but Life on the Mississippi is some of the best writing you will ever see. And there's a particular passage I commend to people where he describes what it is like to be this kid who always wanted to be a riverboat captain, and he's describing the magic of what you see on at a sunrise on the Mississippi, and then he becomes a riverboat captain, and he wonders whether you see things the same way. And he talks about this ripple, the magic of a ripple in the water. And when you become a riverboat captain, you're wondering whether that's some wreck that's supposed to tear the bottom out of your boat. And the end of it was he talked about whether sometimes when you get what you want, whether you have gained most or lost most by gaining your trade. And it's such a profoundly moving reminder of being present and mindful. Anyway, so that on the fiction side. On the nonfiction side, it's really a series that he never finished. It was William Manchester's series on Winston Churchill, which is extraordinary. The third volume was finished by his associate. He was a reporter who wrote history, magic history, and Churchill being just kind of a mess until his moment. The way he stepped up and the way he inspired everybody to step up was to me just incredibly inspiring.
And the final question in the lightning round actually comes from the audience. Thank you, John Hamill, if you're here.
I know a John Hamill. Are you my John Hamill? Oh my goodness.
There you go. What is your proudest accomplishment as governor of Massachusetts?
I hate that question, John. Well, just back to the marathon bombing, the aftermath. I mean, it's so interesting. Today we think of that as two guys and two bombs. We didn't know what we were dealing with. We didn't know how many people. We didn't know how many terrorists. We didn't know whether we'd found all the bombs. We had all the chaos and confusion and fear into which division and destruction could come. But we asked people to turn to each other instead of on each other. And we had been practicing that through policy making and otherwise for almost 8 years at that point. And everybody brought their best. The first responders, the hospitals, all these folks who had life-threatening injuries, not one who made it to hospital died. The first surgery was within, I think, 6 minutes of the second bomb going off, because we had a plan for responding to a disaster that we had developed years before and practiced. But it wasn't just the professionals. It was it was law enforcement, all these different agencies, federal, state, and local. And from experience I'd had in the past, I said, look, you all have a role, but only one of you is in charge of the criminal investigation. And everybody agreed it would be the FBI, and we stuck to that. But beyond the professionals, it was the way regular citizens just took it upon themselves and were encouraged by the example of others to show grace. The way they brought people in from the race when the race was stopped, runners, and warmed them and hydrated them and helped them connect to their families. And in 100 hours, we found 2 terrorist needles in the haystack. That's never happened before. And we were stronger afterwards. So it wasn't a moment, but it was more, John, it was that we learned, we had learned, and then we demonstrated that we could be a statewide community. And I think that was a very good thing for us to see in each other.
All right, well, thank you all again. And we're going to give the governor the last 2 minutes.
Well, thank you all for coming out today. I appreciate it very much. We can stay, I think. Should I give you that? Okay. I am totally tied up here now in mind. I guess I'm staying as long as... I appreciate everyone coming out. I hope we can stay a few minutes to have some conversation. I can find out what's on your minds. I want to invite you to get involved in the campaign and to make it yours. Because, I don't need to be president. I get to be called governor for the rest of my life. It's pretty nice. But I think we have a moment now, and we have had them at other times in our history, when the nation seems poised to really examine the gap between our reality and our ideals and work hard at closing that gap. There are a lot of people, not just in my old neighborhood on the south side of Chicago, but now in neighborhoods and communities all over the country who feel unseen and unheard, who need not government to solve every problem in their lives, but government to help them help themselves. And that question of what the role of government is was supposed to be debated and changed from time to time in our history. It was designed that way. But right now, the kinds of investments we make in each other, the things that make it possible to grow prosperity and justice everywhere, that matters. And that's why I say right now, it's not the character of the candidates alone. It's the character of the country. We have to decide who we are. And because I have lived and believe in the American dream, and when I think about being encouraged to believe in it by black women and men on the south side of Chicago in the 50s and 60s, I think what a leap of freaking faith that was. That lesson runs deep. And it is a thing worth fighting for everybody. There are differences in all of the candidates. Everybody brings something. And I've talked about some of the differences in what I bring. But what I want to leave is what I just described in response to John's question. And that is an understanding that at the end of it all, we have a stake in each other's dreams and struggles, as well as our own. I'm glad you were here. Thank you very much.